Shogun episode 4 came out, and I'm finally about to be caught up with my weekly videos. And this was a really interesting one because it felt like a ton of character stuff and kind of slow paced and building. And then at the end, it just explodes. So there will be spoilers. Quite a bit happens in this episode. I talked in my previous videos about the romance arc between Mariko and John. That's like in a gray area after this one, but I think it's advanced. And I also mentioned Taganori's kid has been like edging towards violence each episode, and that's kind of the climax of this one. The ending's pretty wild, and I'm a little bit jealous of the people who don't watch this until the whole thing's done so they can just binge it and not be sitting here for a week waiting for the next episode. But let's just get into it. So right away, we're back at the little village, Ajiro, where Yubishibe had John's crew, and John arrived initially, and obviously it's his fief, but Toranaga's with him this time, and they're coming back. John thinks to get his men and his ship, and that he's going to train them, but he thinks it's going to be a pretty short-term thing. And the village is preparing because obviously Toranaga showing up as the regent is a big deal. This chapter is called The Eightfold Fence. It's chapter 4. This actually leads to a pretty interesting conversation between Mariko and John. Mariko explains to John. Mariko uses this to explain to John that don't take the fact that the Japanese people bow and they're polite and passive. Don't make the mistake of thinking that they won't act the way they need to, or that they'll just be trampled on, or the fact that they're good, kind people. Because she feels like he's getting complacent and kind of just relaxing in this foreign land because he doesn't actually understand the culture and the significance of the stoicism. To start, we see Mariko talking to Fuji, who is the woman who lost her husband and child to seppuku. Mariko is explaining to her that because John has been made Hakimoto, that he has to have a house and a wife, essentially, or consort. So Mariko is saying Lord Toranaga wants you to be his wife while he trains the men, and Mariko and Toranaga are asking for a year, and Fuji's like, this is bullshit. So she ends up agreeing to 6 months. So Nagakoto, who is Toranaga's son, who I just keep calling Toranaga's son because I can't remember his name, is talking to Yubishibe. Yabushige is like, my nephew's handling the details. He runs the village. He'll take care of it. And Toranaga's son, Nagakado, is like, we need to get ready as soon as we can because war's coming. And he's like kind of excited about it, which is how he's been all season. It's sort of the young guy hoping for war, probably because he doesn't understand what it actually entails. It's usually how it goes. Toranaga gets to the port. He drops off John, Mariko, Yabushige. He's getting a bunch of applause and cheers. He introduces John as his Hakimoto. The soldiers are still cheering for him. He thanks them, and he just kind of gets the hell out. And you can tell that Yabushige's nephew, who's the one who runs the village, is also a little bit on edge. Like, he's wanting to move up the ranks as well. So he's kind of doing like the young brash thing a little bit too, just like Nagakado. And you don't really see Toranaga after this for the rest of the episode. He gives his little speech, gets his cheers, and goes back to Edo. And I think the implication here is that the longer he stays, the more at risk he is of Yabushige betraying him. Because I said that I thought it seemed like Yabushige was coming back to his side last episode, but it also kind of seems like he's just sitting on the fence, kind of waiting to slide over to the winner's side, regardless of who it is. John has some good lines in here. At this part, when he sees Omi again, he says, I know who he is, to Mariko. He says, pardon me in Japanese, and then fuck yourself, you sniveling little shit rag, in Portuguese, so he can understand him. He's got some good lines later on that are pretty funny. And this kind of scene where he's given like the let's get hyped for war speech is why you cast Hiroyuki Sanada. He's just awesome. Obviously, he delivers on the speech. They're all jacked up and chanting his name. As the audience watching, you're like, yeah, I mean, I might run into battle with a samurai sword for him too. He's just great. He's always got great presence, and he's really charismatic. So the deal that John made was for his men and his ship, and that he would train the regiment, and he thought he'd be here for a couple weeks. And he finds out that the ship belongs to Toranaga, and the men are moved to a different place. I'm assuming they're dead, because there's a quick flash when they're cleaning the village up, and it looks like they're cleaning up blood. Not to mention, when we left them, they were all starving and kind of on the border of death anyway, and then being treated pretty hostilely. This isn't a huge thing, but John calls one of the other people Sama, and Mariko explains that you don't do that for him. Essentially, he's lowly. So she's teaching him the nuances of the culture and hierarchy and stuff. And there's a lot of that in this episode, which is pretty interesting. And there's a bunch of little details like this that I like. Mariko's like, your house is ready for inspection. And obviously John's confused. But you can see all of them are walking on the stone pathway, and he's walking in the gravel. And then in a few minutes, he walks across the moss. You can see around the trees, and she's like, don't walk across the moss. It's disrespectful. So all these little subtle things, you can see them on screen, and they get explained sometimes in the show, which is just really nice, the amount of detail that goes into this, and the amount of thought they put into it. Like, obviously, this is filmed in a way that you can see his feet and where he's walking compared to everyone else. This is a pretty funny scene, even though it's kind of serious at the same time. Mariko's explaining he's been given a house, he's been given a salary of 240 cuckoo a year. And he's like, I don't want any cuckoos. And then she also says you've been given a consort, Fuji-sama. And he's like, no thanks. He's like, I'm sure she's very nice. I don't want to do anything to her. I don't want to do any pillowing on her or near her or around her. Which is a callback to last episode, obviously. So the whole scene is kind of shitty for him because he's like, oh, I'll get my men back and my shit back in 6 months if I'm still around. So he's realizing that he's just kind of screwed. But the way that it's done is pretty funny. I think the show handles it with a good balance because you can definitely ruin a scene with comedy at the wrong time or the wrong tone for sure. Yabushige is talking to his nephew and he's getting frustrated that he hasn't figured out who the spy is. And he's like, what are you doing? And this other old guy is like, he's only a boy. He's too young to lead the village, blah, blah, blah. So you have this, and then his wife or consort or whatever she is, kind of in his ear, like, shouldn't you wish for more? So you can see where he's getting kind of poisoned by the people around him to be ambitious. And now Yabushige is pissed off because he's like, it looks like I've completely taken Toranaga's side, and he's going to be the loser. So clearly he just wants to side with whoever wins. He has no loyalty to anybody. And this is Omi, the village leader's wife, consort, whatever she is, that's kind of filling his head with thoughts of power and status and all that sort of thing. She's giving him ideas and he's kind of functioning like a mouthpiece. So she's like the manipulative woman behind the man. John gets annoyed by Fuji because he's like, she's always on top of me. And Mariko explains that it's custom for a consort to always be near and always be awake whenever the head of the house is awake. And he's like, what's a stupid custom? And this is where he steps in the moss and she's like, don't do that, it's disrespectful. So he kind of sarcastically walks back on the path. Just a lot of these cultural differences are really getting to him now in his day-to-day life, even if he has a better status. And he even referred to himself as a glorified prisoner, or prisoner with better quarters. And Mariko is pretty much like, hey, Dick, she deserves to be treated better. She's highborn and whatever. And he's like, well, good for her. And then Mariko's like, yeah, and she also just lost her husband and kid. And John's like, well, shouldn't she be grieving then instead of following around a marooned Englishman? And Mariko says that we honor the ones that we've lost by continuing to live, essentially. So John kind of gets guilted here into treating her better instead of pouting, which he was doing. And this is where she explains the eightfold fence about how they seal their emotions away. So regardless of what they look like on the outside, they could have a lot of inner turmoil going on that they're just hiding or protecting. And here we get a pretty intense scene where they want to take John's guns. And he's like, no, I'm a guest. Like, you're not taking my guns. You guys carry swords everywhere. And Mariko's translating, and essentially Omi's trying to be a dick and say that guns are different than swords and give them over. And John actually says no in Japanese. And then when they go to pull their swords, he draws on them. This is probably the best line of the whole show. He gives the guns over to Fuji. She's obligated to hold on to them and protect them until death. And John says to Mariko, tell this milk dribbling fuck smear I'm ready to go. And she's like, in Japanese, with the utmost respect, the engine apologizes for the misunderstanding. Which is a really funny way to essentially call him a titty baby. And Omi is still trying to be a dick and kind of flex his power. And Fuji draws on him and says, please be on your way. And then he finally backs down. I'm assuming because she's Japanese and highborn. There's a pretty funny little scene in here too where he starts the training and Yabushige is like, show us tactics that our enemies haven't seen yet. And he starts talking to Mariko about a battle from 50 years ago. And she's like, why don't you talk about one that you were in? He's like, I'm a pilot, remember? I'm on the sea. We don't do a lot of sieges on boats. And then eventually he's like, screw it, just let me show you guys how it works. What he's trying to explain is that a siege takes forever, but if they get within like 1,000 yards in the cannons, they can just destroy all of it. And he's like, look, let's just look how it works. So he starts giving out orders and aiming, and they're all kind of laughing like, we've seen the Portuguese try to use their cannons, this is stupid. And he starts shooting the targets pretty far away, like right on target. We get a little montage in here of him shooting the cannons. Mariko's taking notes. We see Fuji writing stuff down. And Mariko is also translating what's in his books. And she's kind of shocked by how much they talked about burning down cities and stuff. And here we get a nice little scene where he's trying to learn Japanese, but he keeps mispronouncing the words, which I can relate to every time I talk about an anime in one of my videos. And I'm only doing names, and I still butcher all of them. So you can see here, she's translating the books, and she's kind of concerned about what she's seeing. Obviously about the destructive nature of what he's done and his weapons and that sort of thing. This is a pretty good scene where John is trying to say, you know, if we can build a navy, I can do all this kind of stuff. It'll help Toranaga, blah, blah, blah. And Mariko's like, you don't know what's best for Toranaga. Like, essentially, you're an outsider, and whatever orders you had don't matter. And John's like, what orders? And she's like, your crimes against the Portuguese. I've read them in your own words. And he's like, well, we're at war. And they're kind of bickering because she's like, he's not going to fight your war for you. And he's like, well, we're both at war and we have some common enemies. So we need to work together right now. And then he says something kind of snide right at the end about you have other masters to serve as well, referring to her stuff with the Portuguese and the Catholics. And then they get like a little small earthquake and it breaks up the conversation. But it does feel like a very real conversation where they're both kind of pissed off at each other. And there's quite a bit of tension there. Because obviously neither one's like, oh, you're evil for doing these things. But they're both frustrated because they have their own goals and cultures and priorities that aren't completely aligned in an era where you'd be pretty unsympathetic to foreigners. And then after the little earthquake, he's like, baby, what? He's super confused. And she's like, they destroy our homes. Sometimes our homes are consumed by fire. Sometimes they're consumed by weather and tsunamis. And she's like, that's why they're meant to go back up as quickly as they come down, because we're surrounded by death all the time. And again, it's just another reinforcement of the cultural differences between the two. But of course, in movies, that never stops love. So if anything, it makes it more dramatic, I guess. So obviously this chick, Kiku, is doing the femme fatale thing where she's sleeping with him and then she's like kind of complaining about his uncle being the lord of their village. And Omi agrees, but he's also like, he makes the village prosper. And you can see she's like, oh, if only you are a lord. And she's kind of filling his head with these ideas of grabbing power, which I'm assuming will be relevant later. Obviously. John is explaining to them how to load the cannons with chains, and it kind of spreads the damage out wider. And he's wanting to show them how it works. And you can see Mariko's taking notes, I'm assuming for Toranaga, so that he can do all this stuff on his own without John. The next morning, they're going to do their training again, and Ishido's men show up, and this is Jozan, who's like Ishido's general, I guess. He's the one who's seen in charge every time he's been on screen. And Yabushige is trying to make excuses like, look, I didn't know he was going to escape. Eventually, they're like, why don't you stay till tomorrow morning? We'll show you a demonstration of our weapons, and you guys won't want to fight us. And he's being summoned back to Ishido, essentially to be beheaded. Or if he stays here, obviously they'll end up going to war and losing, and he'll be killed. So he's really reluctant to do either one. And he's trying to navigate being on both sides. So Yabushige is like, look, if he kills me, he's going to lose a valuable ally, and war is coming after Toranaga's dead. So he's trying to convince him to let him see the cannons and essentially show how useful he'll be as an ally. Nagakado is pissed off about this because he's like, why are we showing them the strength of our weapons? And Yabushige is trying to say, essentially to scare him off, because they'll see how strong your dad is. And you can tell, obviously, by his face, he's like, this is bullshit. And he's explaining that he's been summoned, and Nagakado's like, refuse. So you can see he's still playing both sides as best he can. It's really hard for me to tell who he thinks is actually more powerful. It seems like he thinks Ishido is more powerful at this point. And this is a really good scene where John apologizes to Fuji because he was kind of throwing a tantrum, and he gives her the guns as a gift, and she's like, what am I going to do with these? And then Fuji gives him her father's samurai swords, which were pointed out earlier as a pretty big deal by Hiromatsu, or Toranaga's right-hand guy. She's like, what am I going to do with these? And John's like, she'd be the most fearsome lady in Japan. And Moriko's like, it's for you to protect him. And she says, I'd sooner pull a gourd from a horse. There's a lot of funny stuff in this one, even though it's actually kind of a serious episode, especially near the end. And you can see she says that she's giving him the swords because she can't be the consort to a guy who doesn't even wield a sword. Obviously, all this cultural stuff is getting really jammed into this episode. There's a ton. It's funny because he keeps practicing the language and she keeps correcting him. That's why you can see Mariko's like smirking. He's trying to say Gozari Masaru, which I guess is just like thanks. Seems to be the way he keeps using it in context. And this is pretty funny too. He asked for the natto, and they're both like, you don't have to eat that. You can eat the stew or whatever. And he's eating it, and it's like super chewy. And he's like, it tastes like cheese, like really, really stinky cheese. And he keeps cutting to both Fuji and Mariko, and they're both kind of smirking and trying not to laugh at him. You can see Omi and Nagakado drinking up late, and Omi's like, oh, it's too bad they're going to see our tactics, and he's kind of trying to egg him on. And it seems pretty obvious at this point that Nagakado is going to do something stupid. And these are always the kind of characters I feel like as an adult you get really pissed off at with the overzealous teenagers in movies and shows, like Carl in The Walking Dead. John goes out for a walk and decides to take a bath, and Mariko walks in on him naked. Typical anime fan service. And they start talking, and she's like, a great injustice stole everything from me. I'm not here because of the church. You're wrong about that. And he's like, even if your house was torn down and built 50 times over, I just see a house, and I just see the current you, and you don't owe me any explanations. So this is just a really nice scene where she's choosing to open up to him. And he's like, you don't have to if it makes you uncomfortable. And then she asks about London, and he talks about how it's a city and it's crowded and dirty. It's not like Osaka. And that if they were there, he'd take her to meet the queen, and they'd go for a walk in the Thames and just kind of have a night together, like a nice date. It's all good stuff as far as the romance arc goes, and just the general character development of them learning each other's cultures and just getting closer to each other effectively and fairly quickly, I would say. Screen time wise, and probably story wise also. And her husband only died a couple of days ago or a day ago. And he talks about taking her to a play and asks if they have him here. And obviously it sounds like the generalities are pretty similar. Doomed kings and cursed lovers and all that kind of stuff. So even though they're from different parts of the world, they have a lot in common, is the summation of the scene. Fuji puts John to bed, and then she goes to bed and someone else comes in. And you assume that it's Mariko. In a couple minutes they say they have a conversation where they sent another woman in. Fuji and Mariko did. And John's really confused. I'm like 95% sure that it's her, but I think it's supposed to be so dark that he can't tell, and we don't know either. So they bang. Oh, sorry. Make love. And obviously this was inevitable, assuming it's Mariko. Mariko says, you seem like you're in a good mood. And he's like, as I should be, after a night of good company. And she kind of has a smirk, which makes me think that it's her. But she says, oh, the courtesan was acceptable then. And assuming that it's her, I think the implication is that Mariko can't openly sleep with him when he has a consort already. And her husband just died like a day before. Even if they were in a political marriage and never actually cared. It seems like it's all like a social thing. So that essentially Fuji and Mariko can both deny that they know who it was and just say, oh, we sent a courtesan in. If any kind of news comes from it or gossip or whatever. Plausible deniability, in short. Of course, if it wasn't Mariko, then a little bit awkward for John. And of course, to get the cliffhanger, we end with Nagakado saying, oh, you guys can come check out the cannons. And of course, he has them set up in the distance aimed at Jozan and Ishido's men. And Yabushige is like, what the hell are you doing? You just declared war without your father here. You fucking idiot. And you can see it's just brutal. I'm not going to put it on the screen because I don't know what YouTube's rules are completely. But John and Mariko are both like, what the hell is this? And Mariko's like, don't. This is war. And then the episode ends. And we all get to be pissed off at a cliffhanger and at Toranaga's son, Nagakado, for being a jackass. So I don't know what's going to happen in the next episode. Things escalated super quickly in the last like 2 minutes of this one. So I'm hoping we pick up where we left off. And it's just straight to the news spreading and then chaos. But I guess we'll see. So yeah, this is a really good episode. This might be my favorite one so far. After I said episode 3 is my least favorite because of some coincidences that worked out for them. I really like this one, even though it's mostly character stuff for like the first 52 minutes. And then the last 2 are shit gets real. So if you watch this one, let me know what you think. I really like this episode a lot. I think the rest of the season is going to be pretty awesome. And I think it's going to get pretty intense every week from here on out. So yeah, let me know what you thought. I respond to all the comments, like and subscribe and all that. Thanks. See ya.